and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
Ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today. Oh. And you could even argue if we're even talking fantasy today, as I'm realizing as I'm going through the motion of our intro, because today we're talking about one of the most best-selling, popular science fiction novels of all time, dating back to 1965. It won the first ever Nebula Award for Best Novel and also tied for the Hugo Award. It's got a huge blockbuster movie coming out in just a matter of weeks. We are, of course, talking about Dune by Frank Herbert.
That's exactly what we're talking about, Charles. Yeah, is it fantasy? Maybe that's a conversation for another day, I think. Right, it's kind of space fantasy because it does have the difference from like the more Asimov, like let's really focus on the technology. So and right. I think in part that's part of what makes this such a revolutionary book, is to use science fiction, but to also go like space fantasy, space opera-y, in focusing much more on the characters, on the plot, on the world building, all that kind of stuff, but not from the perspective of like, here's the hard technology and how it's playing out. But anyway, Charles, we'll get a lot more into all of that, I'm sure. But we ought to say that folks are likely, if this went as planned, seeing a much shorter duration of this episode than they are used to when we're giving our book discussions. That's because we are trying out something new that we think will be great for you all, the listeners, because we've been having a lot of these more spoiler-free discussions up at the top of these books, and then we're doing my famous spoiler warning and getting into the deep depths of discussion. But we're like, hey, we want to make sure that folks know what they're getting themselves into when it comes to spoilers or non-spoilers when they click into the episode. So we're creating, hopefully, these shorter spoiler-free discussions, which is what you're listening to right now, where it's kind of like a book review that we're doing verbally amongst friends. And we won't give anything deep away in this one, but we'll give you an idea of the book, what we liked about it, what we maybe didn't like as much. And then that'll just be its own thing that you're safe to click on and listen all the way through if you haven't yet read the book. So if you haven't yet read Dune, you're totally safe here. And then later in the week, maybe in like a couple days, we'll release the full deep dive episode that will just get into the nitty gritty for all you folks who have read the book that we're talking about. So this is the first time we're trying this format. Here's a spoiler-free section, and in a couple days, you should be on the lookout for the deep dive spoiler-filled episode.
That's right. We're taking our book summary, splitting it into the spoiler-free and the spoiler-filled. So right now, Dylan, we're just diving right into the spoiler-free.
And the shallow waters of...
the shallow
that's
waters
the worst
of Chalamet adaptations.
Right. Well, I was going to say, talking about waters in any way, be they shallow or deep dives, are probably the least apt metaphor for the book that we're discussing today.
I don't know. It's the most Dune, precious resource on Dune, and
right.
So much to get into about that. But I think since this is a spoiler-free discussion, and we're talking about this at the highest level, I think it's kind of interesting to think like, okay, we're right now. Like, the promo for the second part of this movie is coming out, right? Dune, right. The movie, was a super popular release a few years ago. Huge. And it was right to streaming.
Like 2021, right?
Yeah, I think it was released like right to streaming and was very popular. And now the second movie's coming out in theaters all these years later. So very excited about that. David Lynch did a movie decades ago, and like it was a big flop, and it's kind of fun to watch in like a cult movie, but it's like super weird and like not traditionally what I would call a good movie. But
I was looking at, I haven't seen that movie yet, but I was looking at the 1984 one. I'm saying I haven't seen. I've seen Dune Part 1, the 2021 movie, but I was looking at the cast and I was showing people in my lab in my PhD program. I was like, this is what Timothy Chalamet looked like in 1984. Like, this was 1984 Timothy Chalamet.
yeah, what is his name?
It's
Kyle
like this
MacLachlan.
bland.
He's great.
Yeah.
But
He looks like, this is tough to say about someone who is decades older than Timothy Chalamet, but I'm like, you look like a knockoff Timothy Chalamet.
for sure. For sure.
Like,
Yeah.
definitely
and
looks like
Sting
the generic
is in that movie
not the
too.
name brand.
Like
Yeah.
very bizarre. But there are some great moments from it. I always like the spice melange. Like, all the whispering. He does like the inner monologue is like the character whispering. It just shows like their blank face. It's a weird vibe. But so that's all to say, here we are in a modern day talking about a book from 1965. And Dylan, you mentioned when we pitched these books that it's always kind of a mixed bag when you read a book that's from the 60s today, because we're obviously reviewing it today. This is part of this episode's dedicated to kind of reviewing it in a modern audience. And I know you always love to separate, like, okay, is this something that you should read as part of your healthy, well-balanced diet, or is this something that you're actually going to enjoy on face value? And I know you're kind of going into it being like, some of this I just gotta suck it up and take it on, and I'll be better for it at the end. But is this really just like eating your vegetables, or was this a nice amuse-bouche? Where did you end up on that whole discussion?
Right. Well, yeah, my idea I was saying coming into it that it was like eating my vegetables is that, hey, there's such an important context-driven reason to read this book, right? You have to, as a fantasy and to a little bit of lesser extent, but also sci-fi enthusiast who wants to know more about the genre that I love and understand like all the ways that this has influenced authors and just the genre as a whole. It's like, okay, like this might not be the most enjoyable read. It might not be as fun as some of the other books that were on tap when we did our Friends Pitching Fantasy, but like it's eating your vegetables. It's good for me, and I'll feel good about myself in the long run if I do it. And that was my attitude coming in. And Charles, I have to say that I was like borderline shocked at how modern I felt like this book read when compared to its contemporaries. Like, and I'll name a couple. It's like, so Lord of the Rings is a bit older, but not by a ton. And I would say this reads way more modern than the Lord of the Rings books do. It also reads, like, I just read Stranger in a Strange Land, which was 1961, so only 4 years before. It reads so much more modern than that book does, as, like,
for sure,
more sci-fi comparison to it. And it's just actually, like, very entertaining in and of itself, I would say. Like, there are aspects that feel a little more dated, and I did... like, it was not lost on me that for some reason Frank Herbert has the same tick of writing the word presently a million times.
Isn't that so
J.R.R.
bizarre?
Tolkien
I noticed that too. I was like,
weird?
Man, I didn't realize Frank Herbert abused the word presently just as much as Tolkien does. I'm like, do we need to say presently all the time?
It never adds anything. There's like no sentence. I can't even imagine. Like, I guess... I don't know.
If someone's like actively going back and forth in time, but it's like, no, it's so bizarre. I'm glad I had the same thought many, many times. And I know I'm a big avid, and that's really interesting that you say that, Dylan, because I knew maybe that you would. I wasn't sure how you were going to take this book because it is dated, but compared to its contemporaries, like I love science fiction and I've read a lot of it, and I've read the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, which is like early 50s, so around Tolkien and all that within this realm, and it is way like more like dated, and it's way more heavy in terms of its like science fiction and technology, and it weighs so heavy on all of that this book just lifts like this modern storytelling narrative like it that has been relevant for 60 years now. And then even reading like the pulp fantasy of the 70s, like I read Anne McCaffrey and Terry Brooks and some of those people who just had serialized fantasy books cranking out, and you're like, even those just read different and have this like older narrative kind of vibe that Dune, which came out 10, 20 years earlier, just does not have. Yeah. So that's I would agree completely.
Yeah. I mean, it is an incredible feat when you take that into account. Like I have some areas that I'm somewhat critical of, and we can get into those. But my number one takeaway was, wow, I cannot believe this was written like 4 years after Stranger in a Strange Land. And like, I'll say though, when was A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin? Like that reads extremely well and carries over an extremely like impressive mark.
1968. That was probably
a little bit after.
A little bit after 68. Guess. So 3 years.
Yeah, so that's the only other book from around that time that I would.
But that too, like, invented a genre, and I think that's like it basically invented young adult fantasy, right? Which didn't exist at the time. And this book, I think, created a genre that you have to kind of appreciate when you go back and read older books. Is like, why is this book so famous when maybe if it came out today, it may not hit as hard? Although we see that the story itself is hitting very well as a blockbuster franchise, but it's because of it basically invented this genre of this like soft sci-fi, or I'll say popularized it at least,
space
and
opera.
Pulled on different levers of the sci-fi genre to tell a story more rooted in the human condition, which is what a lot of our favorite fantasy series do. And I think that was a huge breakthrough and an inspiration for a lot of stories, particularly Star Wars. Even George Lucas says, hey, like the Tatooine, like this Star Wars opens as on a desert planet, and there's all kinds of other parallels to the story I won't get into in the spoiler-free section that directly kind of are influenced lovingly by Dune. So when you influence Star Wars, you know you're on the right path. I'll say that.
Yeah, definitely. And all the ways that it's rooted in things like family and character development and all the other aspects of it, the more sci-fi aspects of it, are there to serve the story and the characters. And I really appreciate that. And I'll also say, I kept thinking when I was reading this book, I was like, I bet you Robert Jordan was influenced by a lot of this. Like, I have no idea. I didn't look into it at all.
I got Robert Jordan vibes too.
There's so much, and I will get into that more in the spoiler-filled section, that feels like Robert Jordan was drawing from. I mean, some of it that I can get into that are not, I would not say spoilers, are the like in the magic system, for the most part, like women are the only ones who can really utilize the magic. And in the also some of these chosen one narratives have been around for a long time, but I see a lot of parallels between the way it's used in Dune and in the Wheel of Time,
for sure.
And
for me, there's like the way he approaches relationships between men and women. You're like, is this progressive or is this dated? It's a little bit of both, you know. It's kind of a really interesting, which we can get more into in the spoiler-filled portion. But I was always just kind of like this is progressive for the time, but it's still rooted in stuff that's not progressive at all. So it's kind of like you get a science fiction story where a guy's in a flying car reading a newspaper. It's like the equivalent. It's like, oh wow, like women are in positions of power and treated equally as men, but
Quote,
they're still just
unquote.
have no voice or agency at the same time. So it's
Yeah,
like this
the
really
characters
interesting.
themselves are
Yeah, it's really
still
like this interesting
hyper
combination.
focused on like how they relate to men beyond anything else. Like
Right.
that is, I mean, but that's the Robert Jordan way of doing it as well. So,
Exactly.
and that was decades later. So I guess Dune. I mean, you have to think compared to what else was being written at the time. It was likely progressive in its time, and then now we can see the
Right.
ways
I
in
mean,
which
Lord of the
it
Rings
feels
didn't even
dated.
have any main female
Right.
characters that weren't just like, they had some which were, but they're so minor. And even the movies
Yeah.
don't pass that. Was it the Turing test? So it's like Dune
No,
at least
not the Turing. It's
passes.
the Bechdel.
Oh, what's
The
the
Turing
Turing
test is
test?
like the can AI pass as human
Oh.
test, I believe.
It doesn't pass that either, to be fair, but it doesn't
No.
pass the Bechdel test.
Bechdel, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't
Yeah.
pass that. Well, this story at least passes that, and then the movies do too, I think. So yeah, it does totally. So
Yeah.
at least there's that.
Yeah. And the Bechdel test, for folks who are not familiar with it, that is, it's like a test to measure how well women are represented in the film. It's a pretty low bar. It's whether a work features at least two female characters who have a conversation about something other than a man. Which is like, you would think, oh, that should be like everything, right? Just one conversation between two
Yeah, they're over
women
50% of the
or
population,
woman
right?
and girl or whatever who are talking about something other than a man. And it's amazing how, or amazing makes it sound positive. It is appalling how few, how many works do not pass that. And I would say Lord of the Rings certainly does not seem to
The
in
movies
my
don't.
like, I think there isn't there like a famous sort of meme where people show like every like they'll do a whole intro with Lord of the Rings and it'll be like every like every conversation between two female characters in Lord of the Rings, and it's like someone like a girl running in and like yelling like they're coming or something like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
to
It definitely
their
it was
mom
like
or
a
something like
character, one
that.
of our main characters talking to like an NPC, like for a
Yeah,
second, is pretty
yeah,
much the whole thing. But yeah, so there is some of that in here, and I think that's at some level like talking about Dune as a part of its time, which I think we've done pretty well. I think as we're nearing the end of our spoiler free, what I'm
yeah.
really curious to know is like where, like putting all of that context aside, how will you approach like your thoughts on Dune the story, Dune the characters, like as
Yeah.
just a 2024 reader of fiction? Were you
Um,
entertained?
I was entertained, but not as much as I would be
Mm,
by let's say something like uh, I don't know, even just like let's say Sanderson, who I really
mhm,
enjoy his works, but probably for me not as quite as much as I enjoy like Rothfuss or Abercrombie or
mhm.
the folks who are like top tier for my own personal subjective taste. But um, it's it's a little like the pacing is a little bit weird. I think where it's like
Mm.
borderline slow for the first like few hundred pages or even more than that, but I would say like a pace I actually like better than this like then weird accelerated pace that takes place at the end where it's almost like whiplash.
Yeah.
So
Yes,
there's
the
like
final
elements of that
climax
that
is just
felt
so
like
fast. It's like
yeah, and
all
just the
this build
last
up for like 20 pages less.
yeah, and there's character development like I'll take myself out of the for its time stuff. Like when you take all of that out, it can feel a little bit flat for some characters. Like some are like the main character Paul can feel kind of one dimensional, as can some others. And then there's secondary characters who are kind of like you're invited to care about them in a way that they never like deserve by nature of showing any like fully fleshed out uh like personality or anything like that. But there's very interesting, I think, like the political intrigue behind it is interesting. Like I liked all the double crossing and stuff
Mm-hmm.
that was going on. I like the like story from a zoomed out perspective of like everything that's happening. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like this is really cool. And uh yeah, it's overall I think I was still entertained. Um
Right.
would I
That's
and it's hard to take away from the context, but I still enjoyed the book even if it
right.
came out in 2024. I was still like, oh, that was a good read. But having come out in 65, I'm like, wow, that is very impressive. What about you,
I
Charles?
I, I agree. There's just so much I really like about the book. You know, the actual political narrative going on is
Mm-hmm.
super intricate. And
Yeah.
it's something that, you know, this is my second or third time reading this book. I saw the original David Lynch movie and, you know, seen the first. So I've like sat with this story for a while. And it's one of those stories that you can kind of, you don't mind seeing over and over and over again. It's kind of like Dragon Ball Z when the new video game comes out. It's the same story. Like Goku fights
Budokai
Frieza.
19.
Yeah, but I don't care because the story just lends itself to being
Right.
like, okay, I can experience this story again with modern graphics or whatever, you know, different fighting mechanics. It's still the same story. It's kind of like my experience with Dune. I'm like, okay, like, it's just the new version. This is the Tenkaichi 12. This is basically this movie coming out in March, and I'm very excited about that. And, you know, the villain, our Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, is a great villain. I think he's so good, and I'll have more to say about him in
Right.
our spoiler filled. But our main antagonist, I'll say, is so good. He's textbook
Yeah.
evil, but it's just like he's so much fun, and just the idea of the spice and the dunes and all these words that he makes
The
up, like spice
aesthetic.
melange, Kwisatz Haderach, like I'm find myself saying all these things, the Benny Gesserit, like all of these words that he's made up. I'm always entertained by. Sometimes going back, reading through the actual book, it's a bit of a lift you have to do. Like it is a little bit
Mm-hmm.
slower, and then like the action-packed ending is slow. I'm sure that these movies are going to devote a lot more time to some of this stuff, and it's going to be a lot more rewarding as an experience. That's my prediction. But the book
Yeah.
overall, I'd say, is good, and anyone who's like an avid fantasy reader has a lot that they could enjoy because it is almost like a feudal society. So there's a lot of these cool um, political maneuverings going on, and you have your like messiah, like chosen one kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing too, which is fun. So there's definitely a lot to digest and enjoy, and just also this whole thing around the ecology of the planet
Yeah.
Arrakis is I think a huge conversation we're going to get into in our spoiler filled, but it's one of the best parts of this book, just the whole world building, which you don't normally think of sci-fi. You don't usually have that world building conversation as much as you do in fantasy, but you could have that exact fantasy kind of scope of world building applied to Dune, and it's all there. It really,
Yeah.
really strong. And the way he ties it into his characters, his character development, and his themes, and just his commentary on modern society. Like, you can read this stuff today of like, over it's basically like oil, right? That's oil in the Middle East is
Mm-hmm.
what we're talking about here, right? The spice that you need to travel. And you have these rich people just like squeezing it as much as they can, and at the sacrifice of the ecology of the land and the native people, right? They don't care at all. It's all about just
Yeah.
extracting as much profit out of this place as possible, and he uses that to kickstart a story. So for me, like, just a rich bed of a plot that you don't get in a whole lot of books, and you only get in like some of the legendary books that you get to read, and like Lord of the Rings could be one of them, and then certainly, you know, some of our contemporary fantasy authors' greatest works do this, and it's just something that it keeps it as one of these tentpole stories that I've always just really enjoyed. It is kind of the reading experience is held back a little bit, but I think anyone who's an avid fantasy reader should definitely pick it up. That's my review.
That's well said, Charles. Yeah. My only add on to what you said there's when it comes to the idea of Arrakis as a world, and it's one of those that when you're reading the book you just like feel like you're there, like you could it's like you are just feeling like you are in this like sun beating down on you desert, like dry. It's like I've probably been more hydrated reading Dune than I've been any other book, because I'm just like getting thirsty and I'm just like downing my water.
Just appreciate
like,
water more.
Yeah, like it is the kind of thing where somehow Frank Herbert is able to just teleport you right onto Arrakis, and it feels like such a real like setting that you are living through. So that's when the setting feels that alive, like that is pretty rare. But we'll get into that a lot more, Charles.
When you read you're told a really intense dramatic story and it's like, go hug your loved ones. This is like you're reading Dune, you're like, go drink some water.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically the same thing.
Right. That is well said, Charles. But I think we've desiccated this spoiler-free section. We've sucked all of the liquid and the fluids out of it.
We've squeezed all the content out of all the juice out of this, and now it's just the desert planet
the
of
water
of
its life, right? The water of its life, that's what they say.
Yes.
In Dune.
Life water.
We've taken all life water. We've taken all of that from the spoiler-free section. I think it's time for us to get into the deep depths of spoiler territory.
Well said. So, compared to other like classic literary sci-fi, this one brings in some entertainment value as well. So definitely a recommended read. And Dylan, I think all that's left to do is to give one of your famous spoiler warnings.
Coming your way. Well, we are now into the spoiler section of this wonderful classic work of sci-fi, Dune by Frank Herbert. So if you haven't yet read Dune, like the first book in this series, then now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones. And yeah, I guess here we are, Charles. We're in a different episode now.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening. And when you do get a chance to read the book, definitely be sure to come back and check out our spoiler-filled discussion. But for those of you that have read the book, just wait a matter of days. We're going to really dive into all the spoiler glory. And I guess you could turn this down your headphones because it's ending, So it's like that's all there is to say. So
I guess,
thanks.
Charles. Yeah, we should tell them. Give us 5 stars on Spotify.
Oh, yeah.
Give us 5 stars. Rate, review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at the FTF Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at the FTF Podcast 1, and perhaps TikTok. I really think it might be out.
We're getting there.
At the FTF Podcast on TikTok. And we'll hopefully see you in the spoiler-filled section.
Yep. Well said, Dylan. Thank you guys so much for listening. This was a fun one. Can't wait to get right into it, which is good because the conversation for us is just gonna go right into it. But for you guys, just a little, it's coming. A few more days. Thank you all so much for listening. We greatly appreciate you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.